Ted never imagined that what began as a hopeful, carefully planned evening, one meant to signal a fresh start, a reclaiming of joy after months of emotional isolation, would spiral into the most humiliating, violent, and publicly explosive night of his life. But from the moment he stepped into the softly lit restaurant with Shanice on his arm, there was already an undercurrent of tension humming beneath the polite smiles and clinking glasses, because Fairmont Crest has a way of weaponizing secrets, and this date, meant to be discreet, romantic, and redemptive, was doomed the second fate, and Shanice's past decided to show up uninvited, beginning innocently enough with flirtation and shared laughter as Ted tried to let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he was allowed something uncomplicated for once. Yet the cracks appeared early when Shanice stiffened at the sound of a familiar voice across the room, her laughter faltering for half a second too long, a moment Ted noticed but chose to ignore, chalking it up to nerves, unaware that across the restaurant, a man with a hard stare and a possessive posture had already locked eyes with Shanice and was slowly rising from his seat, rage brewing with every step as he crossed the room, because the truth Ted couldn't know yet, was that Shanice wasn't just someone with a complicated romantic history, she was a married woman. And the man now approaching their table was her husband, Marcus, a man whose temper was legendary and whose pride had already been shredded by rumors of Shanice stepping out, rumors he had dismissed until this exact moment made them painfully, undeniably real. And when Marcus slammed his hand onto the table, rattling silverware and silencing the surrounding diners, the entire illusion of a perfect night collapsed instantly. Ted frozen in confusion as Marcus snarled Shanice's name with a venom that sucked the air from the room, demanding to know if this was what she'd been sneaking around for, if this was the man she'd been lying to him about, while Shanice stood there trembling, her face draining of color as she tried to speak, tried to explain, but words failed her, and Ted, still clueless, instinctively rose to his feet, attempting to de-escalate what he thought was a misunderstanding, only to be blindsided by the truth when Marcus laughed bitterly and spit out the sentence that would detonate Ted's world. "You enjoying dinner with my wife?" A question that echoed like a gunshot as Ted's stomach dropped and his mind raced, disbelief warring with dawning horror as he turned to Shanice, searching her face for denial, for anything to contradict what he'd just heard. But her silence was confirmation enough, and in that instant Ted felt the full weight of betrayal crash down on him, not just the embarrassment of being played, but the deeper wound of realizing he'd let his guard down for someone who hadn't been honest from the start, and before he could even process it, Marcus shoved him hard in the chest, sending Ted stumbling back into a chair, the scrape of wood against tile triggering gasps throughout the restaurant as Shanice screamed for Marcus to stop, her voice cracking as she tried to wedge herself between the two men. But Marcus was beyond reason, fueled by humiliation and fury, accusing Ted of knowing all along, of deliberately stealing his wife. Accusations Ted vehemently denied as he finally snapped, his own anger igniting, shouting back that he had no idea Shanice was married, that he would never knowingly cross that line. Yet logic had no place here, because the scene had already metastasized into chaos, Marcus swinging first, a wild punch that clipped Ted's jaw and sent shockwaves through the room as tables were overturned and patrons scrambled out of the way, phones coming out as Fairmont Crest's favorite pastime, watching a scandal unfold in real time, took over, and Ted, stunned but not defeated, fought back instinctively, years of suppressed frustration and emotional bruising exploding to the surface as he tackled Marcus, the two men crashing into a nearby table in a tangle of limbs, glass shattering, Shanice sobbing and begging them to stop as staff screamed for security, yet the brawl only intensified, Marcus shouting that Ted had ruined his marriage, while Ted yelled that Marcus had no right to blame him for Shanice's choices, the words cutting deeper than fists as the truth spilled out in ugly fragments, revealing that Shanice had been unhappy for years, trapped in a controlling marriage she'd been planning to leave, a confession that stunned Ted even as it enraged Marcus further, because now the fight wasn't just about infidelity, it was about control, about ownership, about a woman who had tried, and failed, to escape quietly, and when security finally barreled in, pulling the men apart as police sirens wailed in the distance, the damage was already done. Ted bloodied and humiliated, Marcus restrained but still shouting threats, Shanice collapsing into tears as the entire restaurant buzzed with gossip that would spread through Fairmont Crest like wildfire within hours, and as Ted sat there, jaw throbbing and heart pounding, he realized this wasn't just a disastrous date, it was a turning point, because the fallout would reach far beyond that restaurant, touching his reputation, his career, and his already fragile trust in people, especially when the police questioned him, forcing him to relive the humiliation again and again while Marcus insisted on pressing charges, painting Ted as the aggressor in a twisted retelling that conveniently erased his own violence, and though witnesses backed Ted's version, the scandal alone was enough to stain him, whispers already circulating by the time he left the station with an ice pack and a pounding headache, whispers that he'd been involved with a married woman, that he'd sparked a public brawl, that maybe he wasn't the stand-up man everyone thought. And as for Shanice, she vanished into the night. After the incident, leaving Ted with unanswered questions and a hollow ache where hope had briefly lived, because while part of him understood she'd been trapped and afraid, another part couldn't forgive the lie that had placed him squarely in the blast radius of her marriage imploding, and back at Fairmont Crest the reactions were swift and ruthless, with friends choosing sides, rivals quietly delighted, and enemies already plotting how to use the incident to their advantage, especially as rumors surfaced that Marcus wasn't just angry but dangerous, a man with connections and a history of settling scores, raising the chilling possibility that the brawl was only the beginning, not the end, of Ted's nightmare. And as Ted stood alone later that night, staring at his bruised reflection, he understood that one dinner, one lie, had ignited a chain reaction that would ripple through lives, expose hidden marriages, test loyalties, and force everyone involved to confront the cost of secrets in a town where nothing stays buried for long, because on Beyond the Gates, a date is never just a date, a revelation is never contained, and when the truth comes out in public, it doesn't just explode, it leaves shrapnel in every heart it touches. Picking up directly from the wreckage of that night, the consequences of the disastrous date refused to cool, instead spreading like a second firestorm through Fairmont Crest as Ted wakes the next morning sore, bruised, and already under siege. Because overnight the story has mutated into something far more dangerous than the truth, with whispered versions circulating that paint him alternately as a reckless homewrecker, a violent instigator, or a naive fool who should have known better, and none of those narratives give him room to breathe, let alone heal, as texts flood his phone from friends demanding explanations, colleagues urging damage control, and rivals thinly disguising their satisfaction, all while Ted struggles to reconcile the man he knows himself to be with the image now splashed across gossip blogs and murmured over brunch tables, an image that grows uglier when Marcus, emboldened by sympathy and fueled by wounded pride, begins his own campaign to control the narrative, calling anyone who will listen to insist that Ted knowingly pursued a married woman, that the brawl was an ambush, that his rage was justified. And in a town that thrives on scandal, outrage proves contagious, forcing Ted into defensive mode as he meets with legal counsel who warns him that even without charges sticking, the optics alone could haunt him for years, especially if Marcus decides to escalate, a warning that lands harder when Ted learns Marcus has already filed a civil complaint, not because he expects to win, but because he wants leverage, wants Ted cornered and compliant. And just as Ted begins to wonder if the night can get any worse in retrospect, Shanice resurfaces, not to apologize, not to explain in person, but through a carefully worded voicemail left in the early hours of the morning, her voice trembling as she admits she should have told him everything, confesses that she feared Marcus's reaction, insists she never meant to hurt Ted, and claims she was planning to leave her husband soon, a word that now rings hollow, because soon did nothing to protect Ted from being blindsided, soon didn't stop fists from flying or reputations from burning, and as Ted listens to the message again and again, anger wars with compassion, because he can hear the fear in her voice, can imagine the control and manipulation she hints at, Yet he can't ignore the reality that her silence cost him dearly, and that inner conflict leaves him emotionally raw as he faces the next wave of fallout. People he trusted begin pulling back, invitations quietly rescinded, meetings postponed, polite smiles replaced with wary glances, the unspoken question hanging in the air. What else don't we know about Ted? A question that cuts deeper than any punch because it strikes at the core of his identity, and while Ted reels, Shanice finds herself under siege too, because Marcus doesn't retreat after the brawl. He tightens his grip, tracking her movements, showing up unannounced, oscillating between rage and false remorse, telling anyone who will listen that she's confused, that she's being manipulated, that she owes him loyalty, and his volatility only intensifies as he senses control slipping, creating a dangerous pressure cooker that leaves Shanice isolated and terrified, especially when she realizes the town's sympathy lies largely with her husband, not with her. Because Fairmont Crest is far more comfortable condemning a scandal than examining the quiet violence that often precedes it, and as days pass, the threads begin to intertwine in increasingly volatile ways, with Ted learning through back channels that Marcus's anger isn't just emotional but strategic, that he's probing Ted's professional vulnerabilities, hinting at exposing unrelated past mistakes, real or fabricated, and Ted is forced to confront the sobering reality that this isn't a misunderstanding that will fade, it's a vendetta, one that thrives on escalation. And the tension spikes when Ted and Shanice cross paths unexpectedly at a courthouse corridor during a procedural hearing related to the incident, their eyes locking across the sterile space, 1,000 unspoken words crackling between them as Shanice looks both relieved and ashamed to see him, whispering that she never wanted this, that Marcus is spiraling, that she's scared of what he might do next, and Ted, despite everything, feels the old instinct to protect surface, an instinct he immediately questions because every attempt at empathy seems to drag him deeper into a mess he never chose. Yet walking away feels equally impossible when he senses real danger brewing beneath the theatrics, and danger proves to be the correct read when Marcus, humiliated by legal setbacks and emboldened by alcohol and echo chambers of validation, begins making reckless moves, confronting Ted in public spaces, leaving veiled threats, ensuring witnesses are always nearby so he can play the wronged husband if challenged. A psychological game that wears Ted down as he realizes Marcus is less interested in justice than dominance, and the situation reaches another boiling point when leaked security footage from the restaurant surfaces online, edited selectively to show Ted throwing a punch without the preceding shove, a manipulation that reignites public outrage and pushes Ted into crisis mode, scrambling to counter misinformation while grappling with the gnawing fear that no amount of truth will matter once perception hardens. And as the town polarizes, with some rallying to Ted's defense and others sharpening their knives, the emotional toll becomes unbearable, pushing Ted to confront his own patterns, his tendency to trust too easily, to assume transparency where none exists, and to shoulder blame that isn't his, while Shanice, cornered and increasingly desperate, makes a choice that sends shockwaves through everyone involved when she quietly files for separation, a move Marcus interprets as ultimate betrayal, detonating whatever restraint he had left, because in Fairmont Crest, public humiliation is an unforgivable sin, and Marcus is not a man who absorbs loss quietly, setting the stage for an even darker confrontation as alliances shift, secrets resurface, and Ted realizes with chilling clarity that the disastrous date was never the climax of the story, it was merely the spark, because on Beyond the Gates, the aftermath is always more dangerous than the explosion itself. And as the lines between victim, villain, and bystander blur, the question looming over Fairmont Crest isn't who started the fight, but how far it will go before someone finally gets destroyed beyond repair. And just when Fairmont Crest convinces itself that the chaos has peaked, the story veers into even more treacherous territory, because the separation filing doesn't cool Marcus down, it ignites him, transforming wounded pride into obsession as he frames Shanice's decision not as an act of survival but as a public declaration of war, one he intends to win at any cost, and Ted feels the Temperatures shift immediately when anonymous tips begin surfacing, half-truths and insinuations leaked to blogs and social circles that hint at Ted's supposed pattern of inappropriate relationships. Each whisper carefully constructed to sound plausible, each lie sticky enough to cling, forcing Ted into a defensive crouch where every move feels scrutinized and every silence interpreted as guilt, and the pressure begins to crack his composure as he realizes this isn't about clearing his name anymore. It's about enduring a siege designed to exhaust him into submission, while Shanice, trapped between fear and resolve, starts quietly gathering evidence of Marcus's volatility. Old messages, recorded voicemails, witnesses who remember slammed doors and clenched fists, yet every step toward freedom seems to provoke him further, culminating in a chilling encounter when Marcus corners her in a parking garage, his voice eerily calm as he tells her she's making a mistake, that people who embarrass him tend to regret it, a threat delivered softly enough to be deniable but sharp enough to lodge in her bones, and shaken. Shanice finally confides the full truth to Ted in a late-night meeting. Neither of them planned, but both desperately needed, revealing the years of emotional manipulation, the isolation, the way Marcus controlled her social world so completely that lying felt safer than honesty, and Ted, listening, feels the story tilt again, because now the brawl looks less like a random eruption and more like the inevitable exposure of a violence that had long been hidden behind closed doors. Yet empathy doesn't erase consequence, and Ted knows aligning himself with Shanice now could validate every rumor already circling, but walking away could leave her alone with a man spiraling out of control, and that moral crossroads becomes impossible to ignore when Marcus ups the ante, filing for a restraining order against Ted under the pretense of protecting his marriage, a move so audacious it almost works, forcing Ted into court once more where the optics are brutal. Ted painted as the intruder, Marcus as the aggrieved husband, Shanice reduced to a trembling afterthought, whose voice struggles to cut through the narrative built around her, and it's only when a surprise witness steps forward, a restaurant employee who testifies about Marcus's initial shove and aggressive behavior, that the facade cracks just enough to prevent the order from being granted, a small victory that enrages Marcus further, pushing him toward recklessness as he begins confronting anyone he suspects of siding against him, burning bridges with a ferocity that alarms even his allies, while Ted, battered but not broken, makes a decision that signals a shift from survival to strategy, choosing transparency over retreat by publicly acknowledging the truth of the night, admitting his mistakes in judgment while firmly denying any knowledge of Shanice's marriage, a gamble that risks everything but finally wrests control of the narrative away from rumor, and the town reacts predictably and unpredictably all at once. Some soften, some double down, some quietly reevaluate their loyalties. Yet the real turning point comes when Shanice, inspired by Ted's refusal to hide, takes the stand in her own life at last, filing for a protective order and releasing a statement that names emotional abuse without flinching, a move that sends shockwaves through Fairmont Crest because it forces a conversation the town has long avoided, and Marcus, cornered and exposed, begins to unravel in public, his charm cracking, his anger spilling unchecked, until even his staunchest defenders start backing away, sensing the danger of standing too close to a man who cannot control himself. And as the dust shifts rather than settles, Ted understands that the disastrous date has become something far larger than humiliation or heartbreak. It has become a catalyst, exposing how quickly love can turn into leverage, how easily truth can be twisted, and how violence doesn't always announce itself with fists. Sometimes it arrives dressed as righteousness, smiling for the crowd, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike, because on Beyond the Gates, the most dangerous battles are never the ones that explode in restaurants, but the ones that keep escalating long after the chairs are upright and the blood is wiped away, leaving everyone to reckon with who they were before the night everything fell apart, and who they're willing to become now that it has.